If you take a cat and you take off its whole brain, limbic system, so to speak, cortex, you leave it with nothing but a spinal cord and the hypothalamus, which is so small you can hardly even see it, and it's a female cat, and you keep it in a cage, you can't even tell it doesn't have a brain. Because it can keep doing all the things that it did before. So we're going to talk about a structure called the hypothalamus, which human psychologists don't talk that much about, because human psychologists are, what do you call them? They're corticocentric. You know, we need another thing to, what would you say, to resist prejudice against. And modern psychologists are prejudiced against non-cortical systems because they like to think that their prefrontal cortexes, which sort of separate them even from chimpanzees, are the important parts of the brain, and they're not. The important parts of the brain are these parts that are hardly even there at all, and they're really, really tiny. This is a rat brain, by the way. That's called a flat map, so it's like the brain's being flattened out. And this is the brain from the bottom. And these are really old parts of a system called the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus, man, it's important. If you take a cat and you take off its whole brain, limbic system, so to speak, cortex, you leave it with nothing but a spinal cord and the hypothalamus, which is so small you can hardly even see it, and it's a female cat, and you keep it in a cage, you can't even tell it doesn't have a brain. Because it can keep doing all the things that it did before. So it can mate, it can eat, it can drink, it can breathe, it can defend itself. That's pretty cool. It's like there's a whole cat there. It's got a few problems. So one thing is it can't remember anything. So because it does, in fact, use its cortex to remember things. And the other thing is that it is hyper-exploratory. Now that's pretty weird, because you'd think a cat with no brain wouldn't be exploratory at all. But what that indicates is that most of your brain is there to help you not explore things all the time. And the question is, what things should you not explore? And the answer to that is things you've explored before. Now, a cat with no brain can't remember what it explored before, so it's exploring everywhere, and it's hyper-exploratory, and so that's interesting. So we give brain areas names, but the names don't correspond to homogeneity, and that's the case even with the hypothalamus. It's made out of a bunch of subsystems, and those subsystems do things like tell you when you're thirsty, but they do more than that, because the hypothalamus isn't just a drive machine. So the hypothalamus not only tells you that you're thirsty by making you feel thirsty, but it also tunes your perception so that if you look at the world, you're much more likely to look at it as a world in which you could and should find water. And so as your hypothalamus determines that you don't have enough water in your blood, then your perceptions start to tune out everything that's irrelevant to water search, and then poof, the hypothalamus has you do something else because now you're hungry, and then you're not hungry anymore, and well, now you're tired, so then you go sleep, and then you're, sexually desirous, and so hopefully you can do something about that. And then there's the next thing, and the next thing, and the next thing, and the next thing, and that's hypothalamic life. It's one damn thing after another. And so you're in a constant state of desire, and the desires change, but being in the state of desire is something that doesn't change, and you have to be in those states because otherwise you die, and hypothetically you don't want to do that. And so evolution has made you very loath to die. Now, so that's interesting, and so you've got all these little monsters inside your head. Those are Freudian, like id monsters, that they don't drive you exactly. They set up these little stories that you live inside that make you act like a unidimensional cyclops in the search of some particular necessary biological goal. And so that's fine. But it's a bit more complicated than that, because what happens if your search fails? Well, you can't just grind to a halt like a computer would, because then you die. You have to do something else when what you're doing doesn't work. And your brain's figured that out for you, which is kind of helpful. And the hypothalamus has actually figured it out, because what happens when you don't get what you want is partly that you get anxious about it. And that's actually a newer system, and it's also painful, which is also a newer system, and we're not going to talk about that. You stop, because it isn't working, so you should stop at least after some point, and then you explore. And what's so cool about the hypothalamus is that not only is it the system that tells you what to do when you know what to do, but it also is the system that tells you what to do when you don't know what to do. And what you do when you don't know what to do is to look around and explore. when you explore, which is what you can do when you've made a mistake, let's say, or what you can do when you're bored, because if you're bored, why not explore? And what are you doing? Well, you're foraging, because when you explore, you use the same system that squirrels use to go find nuts, because that's what they like to explore the world for, nuts, and so that's kind of what you're doing, except the nuts, so to speak, that you're foraging for are generally abstractions, because you're an abstract creature, and instead of finding nuts, you find how to find nuts, because you're a creature of abstraction, and so we'd rather know how to do something, as Christ said in the New Testament, actually said, if you give a man a fish, you feed him for a day. If you teach him how to fish, then you feed him for a lifetime, and that's kind of the same idea. It's like, would you rather have a fish, or would you rather know how to fish? And we would rather know how to fish, and that's abstraction. And so when we forage for abstractions, because they're worth more than the concrete things they represent. All things considered, what's more important? Doing things or figuring out how to do them? And the answer to that is, never do things in a way that stops you from figuring out how to do more things.